Thank you very much. Can I just draw your attention, even while you continue with your fabulous meal? I'm absolutely honored and delighted to be here today. I thought it could be the attraction of the food that we have so many people, but also I think it's a fantastic panel, so much so that the only person who needs to introduce himself is me, actually. Everybody else is, I think, very well known here. I'm Mohan Kumar. I retired recently as India's ambassador to Paris after 36 years in diplomacy. But really, to cut a long story short, the reason why I'm moderating this panel is only because I spent close to a decade as India's negotiator, first with the GATT and then the WTO. So I'm really happy and honored to be here today. We have a wonderful panel. I think I'll begin with Shihoko to my right, who's actually a senior associate with the Wilson Center and specializes and has expertise in trade, development, and globalization. So just the perfect person for this panel. Then we have Mr. Wang Wen, Executive Dean. So you're an academic from China, and that is the elephant in the room, isn't it? So I'm really happy that you are here to answer questions about China. Shamika Ravi, Director of Research with Brookings India, but also the member of the PM's Advisory Council on economics and trade and globalization. So that's fantastic to have you, Shamika. Welcome. General David Petreaus needs absolutely no introduction. I'm always intrigued by why every general wants to be known as the thinking general. To the best of my knowledge, you are the only one, because you have written books, you teach economics, and so I'm happy to accept you as a thinking general. But I've always wondered why generals, rather than talk about what they've done on the battlefield, would rather be known as a thinking general. So, General, welcome to you. And last but not least, an academic and a think tanker, much like me, I would say Professor Heribert. I hope I'm pronouncing your name okay. German Institute for International and Security Affairs. So a warm welcome to you. My job is really to really provoke, if you like, and then leave it to the panelists to respond. So the first aspect of this panel, discontent about conditions and convergences, consequences of trade. The first question I'd like to pose is, are we wrong about conventional wisdom that a rising tide lifts all boats when it comes to international trade? Were we completely wrong about this theory? So that's the first. A corollary to this is Joseph Schumpeter's theory of creative destruction. What we are probably seeing is massive destruction and marginal creation. So is that also something that you should be questioning, rather than accept that trade is an unconditional good? Okay? So I would say that countries like China in particular, but also India, took great advantage of globalization. Having said what I said, it is true that both China and India, China in much larger measure, of course, has lifted millions of people out of poverty. So what is it that has changed? And I suspect what has changed, at least from my perspective, is that technology, as long as it was an enabler, we were fine. But if technology starts disrupting, and which it can, then I think the scenario becomes much more difficult. And I think, frankly, that if you look at globalization 4.0, we've been talking about it all day. I think the fact of the matter is that a common man, average man or woman cannot take advantage of this phenomenon at all. You have to be super skilled. You have to be super formed and trained in order to take advantage of 4G and of globalization. So inevitably, globalization has, I think, accentuated success and aggravated failure. So we have more losers maybe, or at least losers are finding a very important voice. So for all these reasons, I would say that we need to tackle populism, and I will just conclude this particular aspect by just saying, for me, populism can be attributed to a lot of things. It's a complex phenomenon, but I think it may be directly linked also to gross inequalities, something which we talked about all day today. So if you have the kind of inequalities that you talk about, and inequalities between countries has diminished, but inequalities within countries has increased exponentially, including India, by the way. I don't quite know about China, but India, it's definitely increased. And that causes a lot of social tension as well. Second, will the world's global trading architecture be forced to respond? And if so, how? I think the United States has pretty much forced the multilateral trading system to respond, whether you like it or not. So we have a situation where the most important player still in the WTO has actually kind of led to a situation where the WTO has to respond. We are struggling as we speak as to how this can be reformed. I will just say that reports of the WTO's demise are absolutely premature in my view. The third and last is how can liberal open market economies deal with the challenges of state capitalism? I wanted to say, and I was telling my Chinese colleague, that I spent 10 years in Geneva, out of which 15 years is the time that China took in acceding to the WTO. No country has ever negotiated its accession to the WTO taking this long. You take 4 years, you take 5 years, 15 years, and yet, I can honestly tell you, we didn't see this coming. You can call it state capitalism, call it hybrid state capitalism. It is not something that is there in the accession protocol of China. The only thing the accession protocol of China says is that after 15 years, we will look at labeling China as a market economy. And we all know that the major powers have not yet bestowed the status of market economy on China. So I would say that where do we go on state capitalism? I think, frankly, that at least speaking for WTO, you will have to address this issue. The subsidies and countervail measure agreement is grossly inadequate when it comes to definition of governments, definition of public bodies, and the definition of subsidies. So you will have to address this. How the WTO will address it, I don't know, but that needs to be done. For example, issues like technology transfer, intellectual property rights, these are issues, and as we speak, the United States and China are talking about it, but I think there are implications for other members as well. So with those opening remarks, I'm going to turn to General David Petreaus first. You have the floor, sir, and if you can address at least some of the issues I raised. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Mohan. I appreciate the kind introduction. I guess it's better to be identified as a thinking general than an unthinking general. I must say it brings to mind an old joke that the end of which was that this general in the Napoleonic era had a cannonball go through him and it blew his brains out, and his aide said, "My God, sir, you've lost your brains." And he said, "Brains? Who needs brains? I'm a general." Because I am a retired general, I will open with some quite general comments, which I hope that the experts on the stage here with whom I'm privileged to sit, including our moderator, who spent far more time, again, with the WTO than probably all of us put together. I hope that they will build on that. I will answer one of the questions right up front. I don't think you're completely wrong about rising tides lifting all boats. The problem has been, as I will explain again in general terms, not everyone has had a seat in the boat as the tide has been rising. And that has, of course, been the challenge. Now, I should up front acknowledge, as a former and current professor of economics, among others, I am a believer in global trade. I am a believer in essentially classical economic theory in that regard. I'm a believer in globalism. But each of these, when done properly, for what it's worth, I'm also a strong believer in democracy and free market economics, although I also recognize that every country understandably adapts general concepts to its specific circumstances. I think it's important to note that globalism and global trade have delivered extraordinary prosperity to huge numbers of people during the post-World War II era, and perhaps nowhere more significantly than in China, particularly in the last, say, 20 years of that extraordinary 40-year development that is chronicled in the National Museum now, where the display of the 40 years since Deng Xiaoping welcomed the world to Beijing is, and I went through it when I was in Beijing a week in December. But I think it's also very important, maybe increasingly important, to note that trade has not just had winners, it has also presented existential threats to the losers. So where in, say, the United States, American citizens paid less for blue jeans or shoes or a variety of other goods and services because of globalism and because of multilateral trade agreements, some citizens in our country not only didn't benefit from that, they literally lost their jobs. If you look at the result of NAFTA and the textile industry, a variety, you can pick out individual industries in response to a variety of the different multilateral trade agreements that show, again, that trade has had losers as well as winners, and the losers lose everything while the winners generally gain a bit across the board. And unfortunately, political leaders, I think, have only now come to realize in recent years that, that this is a truism and that they have done too little for those who have been on the losing side of the equation, who have not had a seat in the boat as the tide has been rising. In the United States, there's something called TAA, Trade Adjustment Assistance. This is what is normally legislated and then appropriated for to accommodate the effects of trade on those whose jobs are threatened by trade agreements. And the fact is that it has never been enough in absolute terms, and it has never been enough in duration to offset what those who have lost everything have experienced. Clearly, President Trump played on these grievances during the election against global trade, against multilateral trade agreements, withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's sometimes forgotten, though, that his Democratic opponent, who had spent 4 years as a Secretary of State, she was a close partner of mine in various jobs in the military and then at the CIA, spent 4 years selling the Trans-Pacific Partnership. She opposed that agreement during her campaign because, of course, she could sense where the electorate was going on this issue. And that just illustrates, I think, how significant this effect has been in what is still the largest economy in the world. Again, clearly the current administration does not believe in multilateral trade agreements. I've had the conversation very recently in the West Wing of the White House with significant advisors there. They believe that the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement validated that. They believe in bilateral agreements. And now, to be sure, they're going to negotiate with the EU, but the EU as an entity, and they've also notified Congress that they'll be doing the same with the UK and with Japan. So that is their approach. It may be one that with which I don't agree. I think there were changes and fixes that could have been made to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that could have addressed the major shortcomings that were identified in it, and that it would have been hugely significant from a geopolitical perspective, especially if you were going to do what we now have done, which of course is impose very substantial tariffs on China and essentially declare a trade war by at least another, perhaps by another name. I think that one of the current trends in the world that we see also validates what I'm saying, and that is and of course I'm a partner in one of the world's biggest investment firms, and we do geopolitical, macroeconomic, and environmental social governance issues analysis. Global trade is actually declining slightly in recent years. It is not continuing the inexorable rise that we saw. And of course, there is increasing sentiment, again, against globalism as well. The U.S. initiated trade disputes, the imposition of tariffs, again, are a result of some of the issues that have surfaced. Clearly, the case that matters more than all the others right now is that that between the U.S. and China, and that's quite simply because that relationship is the most important in the world. And I'm delighted to have a Chinese fellow academic on the stage with us to talk about this. There is now, I think, very important to note in the United States, a bipartisan consensus, a national consensus that the U.S. grievances with China are real and substantial and do need to be addressed. This after previous administrations first welcomed China into the WTO, then raised issues with them which unfortunately were not sufficiently addressed, so that we now have true issues about the theft of intellectual property, tariff and non-tariff trade barriers, forced transfer of intellectual property, and so on. Doesn't mean that U.S. firms aren't doing big business in China and profiting from that. Again, we have a huge office in Beijing. We have one in Shanghai. We have a regional office in Hong Kong. But we're generally not in the high-tech areas. We tend to be more in other areas that are going to benefit from the extraordinary growth of the middle class in China. By the way, the middle class in China is now larger than the entire U.S. population, just again to give some scale. I should note as well, I am again one who fervently hopes that the U.S. and China can resolve the differences, that there can be a mutually beneficial relationship. I say that I'm also a member of the Schwartzman Scholars Admissions Committee. That is a program that is within Tsinghua University in China, and I address them every time I do go to China, and did that in December. And I am an enormous admirer of what China has accomplished. I would note, just as a brief aside, by the way, that I think it is not arguable that no country achieved more or benefited more from the rules-based international order and the trade and other multilateral economic institutions than China, because no other country in history has ever done what China did do, particularly in that 20-year period where they had double-digit GDP growth year on year, with maybe one exception around the Great Recession, just barely. So again, I hope that these issues can be resolved. I hope that there can be a relationship which benefits citizens of both countries and, frankly, the rest of the world, because, again, this relationship has enormous implications for the rest of the world. I am slightly heartened that the trade negotiations that have been ongoing in China while we have been here in Delhi were extended for a third day, as I understand it, which indicates that at least there was still talking going on and it was sufficiently substantive to extend for that amount of time. But noting that, I do think that these issues are quite fundamental, and they are going to require decisions at the very highest levels. And I hope that that can indeed be the case as this goes forward, even as there are adjustments that are necessary and understandable. And I would concede, as I have earlier in this forum, that we should have changed the voting rights for China in the IMF. It took far too long for Congress to acknowledge that China deserved a much greater say in IMF discussions than they had at that particular time. And that is an example, I think, of the adjustments that are legitimately needed, but we need to be careful, again, to also retain institutions and norms and principles from which China has benefited more than any other country, even as all the other countries, I would like to think, have benefited as well. Thank you.
Thank you, General. I just want to announce the speaking order so that all of you are familiar. I would request Shihoko right now, followed by Heribert, and then followed by Shamika, and if I can give you really the last word. You are, I think, the most important country in many ways, and therefore I'll give you the last word. Shihoko, can I ask you this question? From your vantage point in the United States, I mean, we all agree that there are losers and winners. Would you say there are many more losers than winners in a country like United States? It's hard for me to accept that. Or is it just that the losers have mobilized themselves so much more politically, and it has been articulated by somebody like President Donald Trump. It'd be interesting, but I don't want to interfere with your speech. So you have the floor.
Let me answer that before I go into my, what I thought I was going to talk about the raising of all votes. What is happening in the United States is there is a growing disparity in income, and that division is seen to be becoming even greater as a result of a growing digital economy. Going back to the trade issue, the United States is actually a net exporter of services. It remains an innovation hub in the world. It is highly competitive. Some of the most aspirational products that we have with us in our pockets, the iPhone, etc., they are made in the United States. However, the problem with that is that they require high skills, and there is a mismatch in the educational system in producing workers that can cater to that new growing industry, and the inability of most workers on average, especially coming out of a public educational system, to be able to meet those demands. So that is really where we are finding a lot of frustration in the United States. We also find that in Europe as well. I do want to say, though, that in Asia, especially in Northeast Asia, which is where I spend a lot of analysis, where I do a lot of analysis on, is that there still is a faith in globalization, that export-led growth is seen as something that is that will move countries forward, that a good trade deal could lift all boats, that it may benefit some more than others, but if we look, for instance, it's been just over 20 years since the World Bank released its seminal book called The East Asian Miracle. This is actually a book that was commissioned in part by the Japanese government, but it outlines some of the ways that these rising Asian tigers, at that time led by Japan, were able to use exports as a way to enhance the living standards of of the entire population. But that is dependent not just on good industrial policy, but there is a social contract as well, that there would be reinvestment back into society to have a strong educational system, to have a strong safety net, to have a strong healthcare system. And these are pillars that still remain at the heart of the understandings as public policies of countries like Japan, like South Korea, and like Taiwan as well. One of the challenges that we're going to be facing as we move forward is that in this digital economy, we are going to find that capitalism is not necessarily going to create more choices. So that when we have companies like Amazon or Google or Facebook, that they tend, especially in the case of Amazon, they tend to give less options. The bigger they become, the less options the consumers have, and that will be a false, it contradicts what capitalism actually stands for, and that is where we start to lose faith. No choices, no less ability to actually be able to access and benefit from some of the fruits of those labors. Thank you.
Thank you. Heribert, you have the floor. I've been wondering about EU's reaction to this trade war, US-China. I haven't heard too much. Are you just watching it with unconcealed glee from the sidelines? Are you worried? Give us a sense of how you see things from Europe.
Yeah, I'll give you a sense. Thank you very much, first of all. This is a very interesting opportunity here. I think it's the first time I'm speaking after the event has been formally closed. The microphone is better now? Yeah.
I think I understand you are also networking, but can I request you please to keep it down, because I think we do have an interesting panel discussion. So please, I will not inflict this on you more than necessary. But let's finish the discussion. I request your cooperation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So let me start with the attempt to answer your question. Of course, China is the biggest issue in international economic relations at the moment. These are not my words. These are the words of Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the WTO, who said, well, we have to cooperate in order to change policies that China implements. Today, the German industry, the Confederation of German Industry, has published a paper in which they have reversed their policies vis-à-vis China 180 degrees. In the past, they were very eager to do business in China and with China. Today, they published a paper in which they are very cautious regarding China. And talking about the European position, it is fair to say that European policymakers are not quite as loud as American policymakers on that issue. It is also fair to say that European policymakers share the same concerns as the Americans. And they've said so publicly. President of the European Commission, Juncker, was in Beijing last year, I think June, July, and he made very clear we are standing firmly with the US and, by the way, Japan, on those issues that are of great concern. Let me try to analyze a little bit why populism is there. Why do we have that? What has happened to the world that made populism such an issue? And just let me list two points. The first is we are still suffering from the hangover of what the Australians so nicely call the GFC, the global financial crisis. I think it is very important to understand that citizens continue to be frustrated by what happened then and what they see as the consequence of the GFC. And let me provide you with a quote. The quote is, "Bankers are paid the earth for socially useless activities." Now, you can assume that this is from the New Left Review. No, it's not. It's from the Financial Times, August 2018, Phil Stevens expressing a frustration of the lack of responsibility that the financial sector has shown for its own activities. This has contributed to populism. A second reason why populism has risen, in my view, is that deep integration has not been as useful as people were assuming it to be. And this is true for both European integration and global integration. In Europe, we have the same problem. People are not convinced anymore that European integration will make their life better. I don't go into details, we talked about it earlier, and we can see that at the global level, Americans, French people, the British people are concerned that globalization is not as useful as it was suggested to them. I think it is also fair to say that working class Americans had a difficult life. There's a study published by David Autor and others in 2016, it's called The China Shock. And David Autor sums it up very nicely. He says, for unskilled Americans, or Americans with limited skills, the last 35 years have been lousy. They have been very good for many people in China, and we should not ignore that, of course not. But for many people in the United States, this deep integration has not been as beneficial as it was, as they were told. And Alan Blinder, another American economist, in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, said, maybe we economists got it wrong. Maybe our emphasis on the benefits to the consumers were kind of a misreading of the situation. We underestimated the potential and actual negative effects for producers. And maybe, and this is the question of Alan Blinder, maybe societies want their policymakers not just to take care of their consumers, but also to take care of their producers. In a wider context, I think it is important to consider that We have, and we talk about that all the time, we have the winners and the losers. David Goodhart, a British, I think, sociologist, has written about that. For those who read the Financial Times regularly, he was married to Lucy Callaway, but that's, I think, history. And David Goodhart said, we have a division in society, and we have somewheres and we have anywheres. And the somewheres you could describe as a person that was born in Sheffield, that grew up in Sheffield, that wants to stay in Sheffield, but has no job anymore. And these people don't buy the promises of, say, if I may use that term, the Brussels elite any longer, that deep integration is good for them. And of course, then we have the other side of the spectrum, that's basically us. That's anywheres, that's people that are socially mobile. You can parachute us on any part of the world. We can make a living wherever we are. And there is a disconnect between those two groups. You can look at France, where you have similar developments. To my surprise, 70% of all French people live in a circle that is 30 kilometers around the place where they have been born. So there are quite a few somewheres, and those somewheres are kind of engaging in a rebellion. And of course, just as a footnote, it doesn't help very much when the spokesperson of President Macron labels those yellow vests as chain smokers and diesel drivers. It's not very friendly an interpretation. But at the same time, and this is also important to keep in mind, globalization has new friends, and sitting in India, I think this is the largest country that has recently changed its position on globalization. In previous decades, India was hostile to globalization, Indian policymakers were always portraying themselves as victims of globalization. No more. Prime Minister Modi is actively supporting the further development of a multilateral system in trade. Many people have revised their positions. I would like to present a poll now, which was taken, well, 2 years ago, but I think it still reflects that globalization has supporters in unexpected quarters. And the question was, is globalization good for your country? 91% of people in Vietnam, 85% of people in the Philippines, and 83% of people in India said globalization is good for my country. And you look at the other end of the spectrum. This is of course the US. This is Britain, France. I mentioned it before. The number drops significantly to something between 35 and 40. So there are still a few people that are in favor of globalization, but not that many. Two final remarks. Klaus Schwab, who is the founder of the Davos conference, and who I think you can call him a true friend of globalization. He had a piece in USA Today about a year ago where he said, we have to change globalization. We shouldn't embrace Thomas Friedman's hyperglobalization anymore. We have to have what Schwab called smart globalization, a globalization that considers the preferences of societies. This is a very democratic principle, and this may at times result in a kind of reduction of trade liberalization, to put it mildly. And my final remark is on Germany. Germany is, as General Petreaus was also mentioning in our conversation here over dinner, Germany is producing fiscal surpluses, and we continue to produce the world's largest current account surplus. And German society is unwilling to consider that this may be a problem for some other countries, because they have to borrow from Germany in order to finance their trade deficits. I think this requires attention by the German well, not just government, by German society. We love to complain about the Italians, but when you consider that between 2005 and today, 97% of Italian households had shrinking or stagnant incomes, you see that there is an issue, and Germany could and should contribute to the solution of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Heribert. I take 2 points made by, first, the general, who says that there is a bipartisan consensus in the United States. I mean, you can criticize some of the tactics of President Trump, but I think broadly, general, that's what you say. And you tell me that the EU shares, if not all, most of the problems and issues that the United States has raised with China.
Of course, most European politicians are afraid to agree with Trump just for the sake of not agreeing with him, but they do.
So that, to me, suggests that there are some structural, deep-seated issues here. And I'm not entirely convinced that a 3-day meeting at a sub-ministerial level in Beijing, you're right, General, I think it's optimistic if you consider the worst-case scenario, but I think we have a long way to go. Shamika, I'm going to ask you, you're obviously next, how should India see this US-China trade war? And I give you 3 multiple choices, and you can pick one. One is Schadenfreude, you know. Second, it gives you valuable strategic space, if you like, strategic economic space. And thirdly, are you going to say that it's China today, it'll be India tomorrow? Do you buy that? So I wanted your reaction on this, and then, of course, you're free to talk about the issue.
So first of all, as a business school professor, I love multiple choice questions. It's an opportunity, Mohan. Of course, what you do with the opportunity depends on the capacity. But the current unfolding of this trade relationship between the US and China, coupled with the fact that China is aging, so labor is getting more expensive. These are opportunities for the Indian market, and we have to view it that is how we're viewing it. And that's where a lot of the ease of doing business changes, which are being promoted within center as well as the state governments of India, are exactly targeted towards using those opportunities. But let me broadly get back to the theme. And you started with Schumpeter. But you know, Schumpeter has another very, very fascinating work on democracy. And in fact, he had said, and this was almost 80 years back, he said that, you know, democracy is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one to identify what is the common good of a nation. And I think it's very telling that we are at a time when we are very seriously discussing state capitalism, what is open market, what does liberal market mean, because these are conversations which I think the great minds were also having way back in the 1930s. But back to a comment that was made earlier. Globalization, by the way, developing countries have been voicing their concerns against globalization for many decades now. Particularly the kind of globalization that had been promoted through the IMF and World Bank and other multilateral institutions, where a lot of trade negotiations were really meant to benefit the countries which had a greater say there. So for a long time, developing nations have been voicing concerns. It's really a recent phenomenon that we are seeing this sort of struggle within the developed world against globalization. So it's not a new phenomenon. We just have to view it from what does each country gain from this. Of course, the answer to what is happening today is not isolationism, right? A lot of it has to deal with the fact that what are the new terms of trade? That's number one. Of course, data and trading in data comes up with its own bag of concerns because we haven't quite understood what the terms of trade when it comes to data are, unlike goods and services. So that's another area of concern. But the financial crisis of last decade, if anything, it has taught us that the trade agreements of the nature that have existed in the past will not do. Trade agreements which largely represent large corporates at the expense of ordinary workers is going to have this incredible fight back. through the electoral systems of most democracies, right? That's what we're seeing today. But speaking from India's perspective, we have gained tremendously in the last 25 years. In fact, while you did speak about inequality, but there is something I think which is a first-order problem for a developing country, which is poverty, and extreme poverty at that. And India has lowered its poverty significantly in the last 25 years. And it has been relatively equitable growth if you look at the fact that our states which have been growing fastest have reduced it across rural and urban, across minorities and SC, STs, across women-headed households. So it has truly been poverty reduction in a very equitable sense. However, now we're getting to a stage where inequality becomes a concern, and it's a timely debate to have had. But let's not undermine the fact that globalization has led to this engine of growth in the form of the IT sector or other services that we have gained tremendously from. And therefore, there is an appetite in the country to strengthen that further. Right? Of course, protecting the national interest, and which is what he said, globalization means very different things for different countries. Now, in electoral, and this is where Schumpeter's point is very critical, in electoral democracy, perhaps what we have right now, the people who have gained from globalization, with the rising of the tide, when you say, that group isn't quite well mobilized and organized because also it's behavioral economics, we tend to downplay gains. But the group that has lost out, and I'm talking now of the developed nations because that phenomenon isn't quite obvious in our country, right? There is no one obvious group that is lost out and therefore we need to respond. So it's very much their problem. But if we are to understand it, then you have to understand it within electoral democracy. And that group is what has led to the Trump phenomenon or a lot of the other phenomenon. It is not. Democracy is not a sufficient condition. We will have to come up with new terms of trade as far as future of globalization is concerned. Those are my broad set. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamika. Wen, I can call you Wen.
Okay.
So you literally have the last word. But if I can just ask you a couple of things, and then, of course, you proceed to make your intervention. First, I think as long as China, bided the time and you hid your strength and you smiled, you were okay. But I think the Made in China 2025, did you scare the hell out of everybody, especially the United States? So that is one thing that I would like to ask you. Was it a strategic mistake? I mean, you didn't have to announce it. You could have quietly gone about doing it, and maybe half the guys wouldn't have known. So that's the question I ask of you.
Okay.
The second thing is, of course, the US-China trade war.
Yes.
It's one thing for you to buy enormous quantities of agriculture, energy products, bring down tariffs on American auto imports, and I know you will do that. But what about intellectual property rights? What about technology transfer? And what about the ability of foreign companies to participate in Made in 2025 with 100% ownership? Would you be okay with that? Okay. So I would like you to begin with that, and then, of course, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you. This is a final panel. I'm a final speaker. It's very lucky. But unfortunately, the time is very, very limited. I'm lucky. I'm unfortunate. But the part, why? Because I want to talk so many things. Because in the past 3 days, every panel talking about China, 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 China. And it looks like that China is a challenge. China is a threat. China is a problem. No way. China is an opportunity. China is an interest. China is it's a contribution. China is an advantage. Why few people talking about that? Huh? Ask those ordinary people in the street of the India in New Delhi. They buy a very cheap made in China. Ask those why general you want to make a center in Beijing, in Shanghai? Because China is an opportunity. Why? Ask those investors who invest in China in the past many years. They earn so much money from China. So I think it's a big mistake, misunderstanding. That's the first point. Second point I want to say is second misunderstanding is that I think that it's very normal for U.S. and China tension, especially in the trade war. Why? Because you think You think China is a number 2 economy and the US is a number 1 economy. You don't have to imagine the number 1 and the number 2 has a very good relationship in the history, in terms of historical experience, right? Even a couple, you know, one joke is that as a couple in his lifetimes, each one has 100 times to imagine kill the other one, right? So even couples, they have the conflict. I think that US-China is very normal. So I think, fortunately, 2 days ago, the US and China have made a very positive progress on the negotiation on the trade. In terms of the President Trump's Twitter, President Trump said, oh, it's going very well. So it's but I think, even that, I think that it's very normal in the future, tension between US and China. As long as there is no war between military war, general. As long as there is no military war between US and China, I think every tension, every friction between US and China, it will be normal, will be acceptable. That's the first. Second thing is that I believe both sides, both US and China, our leaders has enough wisdoms to resolve the tension, to avoiding the Cold War. But I admit that even in the US, there has a few people, they want to launch a Cold War on China. They want to deter the rise of China. But the problem, I think, I don't believe the Cold War between US and China will be happen. Why? Because China don't want to launch a war with US, as the Soviet Union did. One very interesting signal, one very interesting phenomena was like that. In the past 1 year, everyone knows there was a trade war between US and China. For the US side, President Trump every day tweet on China. But did you know our President Xi Jinping, Premier Li Keqiang, all the top levels of China government never talking about the trade war. Only our spokesperson of the foreign ministry and the commercial ministry. Why? Because we keep the patience. We respect the US. And we don't want to stimulate US angry. And we try our best to find a solution to solve the problem. So this is the final remark is that I think globalization has no winner and a loser. For the Western media, they talk too much about the loser. If talking about the loser, no any people lost than China and India. For example, iPhone. In the past 10 years, the iPhone company invested China. They earn over 90% interest. Our Chinese farmer worker, they just earn very, very little salary, only maybe 2% or 3%. But for them, millions of farmer workers in China, they work very hard, very, very hard. So I think my final remark is that in this time, Western society should learn from India and China's people, because in the past 10, 20 years, most of the India and the Chinese people, they work very hard, and they changed their country, and they make progress. Don't complain globalization. If you complain too much globalization, you will be the real loser. But work hard, and our government stimulate the people working hard. Then change your country. Then make your country great again. That's my point. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Wen. That was fascinating. I do concede your point, though, and it's interesting you say that to the tweets that were made by the Honorable President of the United States, none of your leaders responded, and it was your spokesperson. So that's true. You've not really added to the rhetoric, if you like, and that's true. That's something that has been noticed. As a special exception, Heribert, I'm going to give you the floor, since you signaled to me. Just a minute. And then if I can request young scholars first. I mean, Samir has instructed me and said he will not call me next year if I don't give it to the young scholars first. But I think we have, look, we're going to be here till 10:15, so we have half an hour. Many of them want to go directly to the airport at 10:15, so we will give you all the floor. But Heribert, very quickly, please.
Very quickly.
Sure. Thank you.
You mentioned trade wars several times. This conflict is not a war. In a war, you try to harm your opponent. In a trade war, you harm yourself. You harm your own citizens. And it is more a binge drinking contest. And who can take more harm to itself. And those who fall over first, they lose the contest. The second is, I appreciate the optimism of Wang Wen on China. The only problem I have with your statement is Chinese citizens are not as optimistic as you are, many of them, millions of them, because they want to get their money out. This is the best signal that they don't have all that much confidence in their own country's future. I don't want to give examples of other countries where that phenomenon could have been observed or could be observed. But this is a very interesting development. Chinese citizens want to get their money out. And where do they want to park their money? In the old, established, boring democracies of the United States, in Canada, in Australia, and so on and so forth. So, with all due respect, maybe it is a bit more complicated regarding the balance of China's rise. Thank you.
So, thank you. We have half an hour. If I can give 20 minutes for questions, and the panelists will spend 10 minutes picking and choosing the questions they want to answer, because that way we'll have, I think a lot of people raise their hands. Yeah. You have to really do this in 1 minute.
Sure. I'll be very quick then. The question. First, I have an objection with the word it's a trade war. I think it's inherited from the Twitter trend. It should have been, or it could have been, the clash of commerce. That's a suggestion, I think. And I would like to know from Madam Yu, and before that, I would like to just for 15 seconds, so I talk about a couple of datas, 91%, 80%, 83% from Vietnam, Philippines, and other country. But the thing is, when you talk about this data, it takes a couple of seconds to talk about data. But you know, I want to address this thing. Once a study came where it says India's women's scenario is worse than Afghanistan and any country. Later, it was surveys only 500 people. So we have to think about how many people are studied. I don't think 1.3 billion people have been studied, at a proportionate number have been studied. My question is now, will there be an impact of trade war in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, locally and regionally? That's my question. And to the Chinese gentleman, I have a question. Jack Ma has joined a Chinese Communist Party. Is it capitalization of a communist political entity? Thank you. I'm so sorry for being elaborative.
Thank you. Teresa Fallon. Very quick, please. We'll take 5 questions and then...
Hello, Teresa Fallon, Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. Thank you to the panel. I have a question for Heribert Dieter. Excellent presentation, but you said something which I found kind of odd. You said no European leader would want to agree with Donald Trump, but if Europe and the US have the same complaints, isn't this just another case of Europe free riding on Donald Trump being kind of a bully, but actually getting things out of China? Thanks.
Yes. Yes, please.
I think young, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Professor Wang Wen. China has been the subject, or the elephant in the room in most of the talks over the past 3 days. Nobody has addressed what I would consider to be some of the most structural problems of the Chinese economy in the long term. Specifically, I'd like you to comment, if you could please, on things like the demographic challenges that China will encounter over the next 20 or 30 years. China will grow old before it grows rich, according to many economists. And in addition to that, the Lewis turning point happened in 2012. We're looking at massive issues of environmental degradation, which have an enormous impact on the economy, and also an increasing but still relatively weak social safety net, especially for people with a non-urban hukou or residence permit. I'm talking about at least 600 to 700 million people who lack that. So if you could please just comment on the demographic challenges in particular. Thank you.
Thank you. The mic here, yeah.
As we said, in the last 20 or 25 years, in a unipolar world, there's no country that has benefited as much as China. So what changed in the last 7 or 8 years? This question is both to you and to General, that China started arming itself. What need did it feel? Because it wasn't threatened. It had no territorial disputes with anybody in these 20 years in this unipolar world. And now, with the might of China coming very obviously, with 83 ships being put out in the last 5 years, so what is, and that's what has really set the cat amongst the pigeons, and the whole world seems to now be frightened of China. What made China pivot, and instead of using its resources for the betterment of its own people, instead of arming itself?
Thank you. Last question for this series, yeah.
Thank you, Mohan. I'll try to be brief. Andre de Melo Souza from the Ministry of Economics in Brazil, a country that since January of this year has its own version of Trump in power. But anyway, it seems from the discussions of the panel, we're witnessing a reversion in the globalization process, which is largely driven by populism, and we have many instances of that. But this is not the first instance of globalization that we have in human history. The latest one in the end of the 19th century was arguably even more intense than the current one, but it's different from current globalization in two main ways, from my point of view. The first one is labor was a lot more mobile in the late 19th century than it is nowadays, and particularly unqualified labor, as you put it, Heribert. And secondly, the role of the state was very different as well. Today we have welfare states. We expect a lot more from the state than societies did in the late 19th century. So there's all these expectations that are not being fulfilled, again, particularly for the labor that's non-mobile, and that has become increasingly non-mobile relative to capital, which is unqualified labor. They're the real losers from globalization, and they're the ones who are voting for Brexit, for Trump, for Bolsonaro, and for the likes. So I'd like to hear the panel, your thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just to facilitate an orderly what shall we say, conduct of the proceedings. We'll start with Heribert. Very brief question from Teresa. If you disagree with Mr. Donald Trump, but you seem to have the same grievances you said vis-a-vis China.
I totally agree. European policymakers are not speaking up. They are free riding, as you suggested. They like it, but they're free riding. And if you read statements also by Cecilia Malmström, she says she agrees with the American concerns, but she only does that in a very candid way. So yes, we are free riding. That's all I would like to comment.
Thank you. When, as always, the bulk of the questions, I'll just repeat it for you.
Yeah, I
One
remember
is,
that.
you remember all of them?
Yeah,
the demographic
No
challenge,
problem.
the rearming of China, and the unipolar world.
Party member,
yes,
right?
go ahead, please.
Okay, I answered it very directly. One, I think about the community party member or as Jack Ma, I think it's very normal. So it's a huge misunderstanding again. Why? Because did you imagine in China there are huge population, 1.4 billion people. How can they work hard? What is the policy to stimulate and encourage people working hard because of party member? I'm a party member too. But yeah, if you're talking about a community party, you will always talking about ideology, communism. No. My father, my mother, my leader, my boss often encourage me that as a party member. Because if you are a party member, you are the pioneer. You have to working hard. You have to lead your neighbor, your brother, your colleagues, go ahead. So the party member is a core of the country, is a core, is a center of the 1.4 billion populations. Don't even identify the Communist Party as an ideology, something like that. It's a misunderstanding. That's second. That's first. Second point is that China's future, of course, China has so many problems. I'm a think tank scholar. In China, I often invited for the ministry inside conference. I often criticize my government because in China there are so many problems. Huge population, huge land, and pollution, and hukou problem, and the economic slowdown. But what we can do? Just reform and opening up, continuing reforms. So that's why, and working hard, people working hard. And also, for example, 6 years ago, corruption in China, I know India has a very huge corruption issue, but corruption in China very serious. And everybody in China hate corruption. And then President Xi got an administration, and he pushed anti-corruption issues. One question talking about what happened, what changed in the past 6 years. I think in the past 6 years, the huge change happened in China. You didn't mention, you didn't notice. That is digitalization. China happened the digital revolution. So that's why in China we have 4G and 5Gs, and we use a smartphone can solve everything. For in China, most of the younger generations, they don't use cash. All the year, they just use an iPhone. A smartphone can solve everything. I think this is China's advantage. I think this deserves for learned by the world because of reform, because of we use the technology revolution. And final, how about the future? I think future, China still has exists a lot of problems. But if you analyze China, don't focus too much on China's problem. Looking at the reform and opening up policy in the past 40 years, so many media talking about collapse of China, threat of China, talking about China's problem. But in the past 40 years, the reform and opening up policy made a huge progress and achievement and changed the country. So time can solve the problem. Give China enough time and let China reform, encourage China reform, and give China opportunity to serve world, serve globalization, serve US, serve Europe, serve India. That's China's contribution. Thank you.
When I don't mean to put you on the spot, but there was one question on arming of China. I thought it was an important one. But if you don't feel like addressing it, that's fine.
No. I think it's very easy. I think
to the general. Okay, maybe general. I think we need to wind up. Samir is hinting massively from there. We will wind up in 3 minutes, sir. So, general, maybe you can also, while you deal with the arming of China, also address the issue by our Brazilian friend, which I thought was interesting. The role of labor mobility and the role of the state was very different in globalization that happened before. And now, with all the immigration problems and everything else that your countries are facing, labor mobility has reduced and the role of the state has increased everywhere. So do you think there is something to this? Is he on to something? General, you have the floor. And the last word.
First of all, I think it's vastly more than just labor mobility. I think populism is a result of a number of different factors. As always, it's an equation with multiple factors, and I think there are different coefficients in front of those that weight these factors in different countries, frankly. But generally, certainly, it's been produced by what was highlighted earlier, I think, the wage stagnation by a substantial sector of the US population and of other developed countries in the world. Loss of livelihoods in some cases as a result of multilateral trade agreements. There have been countries, particularly in Europe, that have been very heavily affected by an enormous influx of refugees and questions about whether they could integrate those refugees into their culture. I mean, Germany is the poster child for this. There's no reason why Chancellor Merkel shouldn't have won the election going away, again, running a fiscal surplus, a huge current account surplus, very low unemployment, seemingly have the answers for how to train the workforce of the future, security, you name it. Germany has even great weather, and the Zugspitze and everything else, and yet, because of her taking in 1 million refugees, she literally put her job in jeopardy, and it cost her the leadership of her party ultimately. And again, a number of other factors, I think, that there's a certain degree of resistance to multiculturalism, a questioning about, again, the emergence of ultranationalism. The alt AfD party, of course, in Germany is one of these, Marine Le Pen in France, and so forth. So again, I think it's much more than just, if you will, reduced labor mobility or something like that. I think it's many, many factors all put together that contribute to this and do it in different ways in different countries. I do appreciate you reminding us to work hard. It did though, it reminded me of the European description, and this is the Europeans saying this now, not Americans. But the Europeans have always said that they work to live, and Americans live to work. So I take that comment a little bit personally as one of those who does live to work. Look, I think the question, what prompted Chinese leaders essentially to stop hiding their light under a bushel, which is how Deng laid this out. Let's remember that we should worry about domestic issues, domestic development, domestic reforms, and let's not scare off the neighbors just yet. All of that should be done very quietly. And I think it is dramatically different for China to be as, the phrase in the United States would be in your face. I mean, this is a very direct, almost slightly confrontational about made in China in 2025, about dominating these key technologies, dominating in each case. Building islands in the South China Sea after they said that would stop, then militarizing them after promising that wouldn't happen, theft of intellectual property resuming after there was a promise made. I think these are inexplicable, actually. I think, actually, they are explicable. I would suggest that this has to do with domestic party politics and domestic national politics within China in a meritocratic one-party system, noting that party is very, very large. The membership of it is really quite enormous. It's larger than some countries that are represented here this evening. And I guess that's the only explanation. But I think this is a question that history is going to come back to again and again, because I think what was implied there was, gosh, things are going great. Nobody's benefited as much from this system as this country has, so why rattle the cage? Why threaten, in a sense, that system? Why undermine it? Why? Certainly, again, as I pointed out earlier, there have been some legitimate grievances, I think, from China. And those legitimate issues should have been addressed more expeditiously in some cases. The one I held out was the IMF voting rights. There are many others, though. And by the way, now you heard India has these same legitimate, I think, aspirations and, in a sense, grievances that they are not getting their clout, that they would like to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, or have more clout again in these different multilateral institutions, some of which have been frozen in a bit of stone since the end of World War II, when the victorious countries determined how these institutions would be established. But again, I do think that this is going to be a question. I'm sure that it is knowing, again, to some degree, or at least having analyzed as the director of the CIA and a four-star general, the leaders of China, that this has to be a question that is being raised, albeit gently, behind closed doors, given the direction on which they have already proceeded. I might just end maybe by noting there was a wonderful analytical piece by one of the the biggest hedge funds in the world, Bridgewater, and they do terrific analysis each day, in fact. And it's very, very good perspective on China. Ray Dalio, the founder, and still, I forget his title now, but he has been to China innumerable times since really the very opening of China some 40 years ago. And you can indeed describe the great problems that China faces, and these are serious problems. Losing 5 million people a year out of their workforce because of the aging of the population. It will grow old before it gets rich, at least by certain standards, although again, its middle class is already bigger than our entire population. Shadow banking, still haven't really resolved those issues. Certainly pollution of air, water, ground. There are these wealth management products, many of which are sort of zombie, made of zombie organizations that will have to be wound down. The fiscal stimulus that has been such a huge part of the development of China and in producing the infrastructure that in many cases just amazes the rest of the world, and I'm among them, did come at a price, and that price is the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world. Again, you can go on with these different issues, and they are very significant ones. But Ray Dalio, I think, got it right when he summed it up. And he said the title of this piece was China's Great Problems, ... and China's Great Leaders. China's leaders have been able to address these issues time after time. And again, there have been many cases where people have said, oh, China can't innovate. They don't have access to Google. How could they possibly innovate? Well, I've spent a day at the Hangzhou campus with Jack Ma, and let me tell you about innovation, or with Xiaomi in Beijing, or any of these others. These are world-class innovators at the level of a Jeff Bezos or Reed Hastings of Netflix, or the others that have personally driven an organization its entire history. And so again, I think it would be very unwise to underestimate the ability of Chinese leaders to come to grips with the issues that they have. But I do hope, frankly, again, because I want to see a mutually beneficial relationship, I do hope that there is a recognition that there are legitimate grievances on the part of other countries, and that these are sufficiently serious that there is a bipartisan consensus in my country and arguably in the other largest market in the world, the EU, that these are very, very serious problems that do have to be confronted and can no longer be pushed aside, or there can't be promises that are not immediately. There has to be an actual pathway. And that will be the challenge for the trade negotiators. It's not going to be enough to say we will do this. It is going to be step by step, I suspect. There will have to be an actual action taken, and then there will be a reduction and so forth and so on, if you see what I'm saying here. So that the situation is dramatically different globally, I think. And again, my hope is that wise leaders can indeed come to grips with this, even if some of them do, wake up at 4:30 in the morning and reach for their cell phone and tweet.
Thank you. Thank you. When half a minute, I suspect Samir wants to say something,
yes,
but thanks for the fabulous panel. Thank you for your attention and patience. But when you have the last word,
Yeah, very quick. General, thank you. I really learned a lot from you. I think that in the past many years, China learned a lot from US. But I admit now US should continue be the global leaders, really. But the problem is that maybe President Trump should be better. But for China, I think if you ask a question to ordinary Chinese people, most of them will answer you. China don't want to be the global leader. No, we don't want to be the global leader. To be honestly, and also but the problem is one very useful experience for China's success in the past 40 years is that learning by doing. We learn from every country. US, even India, Europe, and then doing, and then reform. I think this is a very pragmatic experience to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Samir Saran. You have the
Please
floor.
join me in applauding the fantastic